don't we start by discussing the new remix disc and have you tell me what appealed to you about having other musicians step in and rework your material?
I think a lot of musicians feel the same way as I do, in that remixes more often than not are unsuccessful in the kind of reevaluating a piece of music and really putting a new light on a composition. And to be honest, I've been fairly reluctant to delve too deeply into the whole remix culture, just because I felt that, for the most part, the people remixing the work would rather be creating their own work, and they're really just doing this on the basis of a commission, so it's a paid job, In that sense, you're really only getting so much commitment. And very rarely, as I said, do these remixes better on the originals or kind of further the content in some way, the emotional content or whatever of a piece of music, elaborate on it any further. So, but having said that, having completed Blemish, and particularly in relation to the work that I did with Christian Fernez on that album, I thought the Blemish material offered a unique opportunity for certain individuals to get to grips with and really, rework the compositions in a rather elaborate manner, because I felt that they were particularly malleable in that way. They, akin to an a cappella piece, in that you can take a song that's been sung over a click track of some kind and really just take that piece of music in any direction you choose to. And I felt that some of the Blemish pieces had a similar quality or similar potential. And for the most part, they were recorded over drones, or I think at most 2 chord pieces, with the exception of the Bailey compositions. And so I thought this lent a great deal of freedom to any of the people that might want to get involved with the material. On top of that, there was the notion of working with artists that I'd come into contact with over the past year or so, and kind of use the remixes as a way of testing the water for the possible future collaborations of one kind or another. Ikeda had done a wonderful remix of the World Citizen piece with that Gruij and I had worked on together. And I felt that he really got to the heart of the piece very, very successfully, and elaborated upon the emotional heart of the work in a striking manner. And I thought that it would be very interesting to hear how he would get to grips with something from the Blemish album. And again, he came up with a striking reinterpretation of The Only Daughter, which really displays his commitment to the process of remixing material, as well as the enormous range, the surprising range in terms of his own ability, his own technical knowledge, and so on down the line. I was in touch with Bernd Friedman, and we were talking about doing some work together, and I said, well, in the meantime, would you be interested in some remix work? Because I know he does a fair amount of it. And, he dived in with the remix of Blemish, and that worked out very successfully. And so he had a second crack at another piece, and so on down the line. All of these people involved in the album, in one way or another, I was in contact with them in regards to possible future collaborations, and that remains the case. This is, like I said, just testing the water to some degree.
When one thinks of a remix album, one immediately conjures up ideas of cheesy dance floor remixes. Do you have any concerns about who such a remix album might reach, or how the term remix might be interpreted by people who see this sitting on a shelf?
Well, I guess one's trying to, move beyond that the concept of, or the received notion of what a remix album is, or can be. Push the envelope a little further. I think it makes a great deal of difference if it's the artist in question commissioning the remixes, because I knew who I wanted involved in the album, and I thought I had an idea of where they might take certain pieces, and So there was, a little bit of background knowledge in terms of their area of expertise and the area that they tend to explore when they're working as remixers, and their connection with my own material. So I wasn't exactly working in the dark. So that, yeah, I guess in there, this is just true for maybe a lot of areas in which we work. You often feel disappointed that the concept is being often greater than the results. The notion of a remix is potentially very exciting. Expanding upon an original piece of music, furthering that conversation in some way. But more often than not, as I said, it's basically a paid job, a commissioned work, and there's only so much commitment put into such a project. And if we are just talking about dance floor remixes, there need only be so much commitment, because it's not a difficult job, dare I say. It's not a testing job. I'm sure there are challenges involved in it. I don't mean to denigrate the genre at all, but you know what you're working towards, and there are a lot of givens involved. But if you're taking a composition and you have absolute freedom where you want to take it, then there is a creative challenge there, or possibly a greater creative challenge involved. And there's no reason why that can't be almost as stimulating as creating a new composition from scratch. And I hope that was, part of what got these collaborators involved in this project, that there was a challenge there, that there was a real desire to try and explore the psychological terrain that these pieces covered. They were pretty intense pieces, and to take them, that much further, or to place them in a new context, a new light, must have been an interesting challenge to some degree. I know that I was really asking a lot of the remixers that got involved in the Bailey pieces, because I think they were particularly difficult to get to grips with. But I think they both produced interesting results, and particularly Asano came up with a wonderfully committed remix, which was thoroughly entertaining from my perspective.
I'd like to also talk to you about your record label and get you to discuss the choice of artists, the music thus far, and how all of that reflects your personal aesthetic.
Getting involved with a record label is something I seem to have fallen into, not by accident, but by default, really. I guess it all started out with the album Blemish, having that material in my hand and not really having the desire to shop the material around. I felt that the material was complex, rather difficult material in comparison to my earlier work, or much of my earlier work. And I didn't feel like trying to talk labels into taking this on board, and then seeing them really, as has so often been the case in the past with Virgin, really not know how to market it and not really comprehend it. So the notion of creating a website from which to sell the album, just keep it as a very low-key release, appealed to myself and everybody involved. And that's all we set out to do. And it just kind of grew by, in increments over a period of weeks and then months and then years. And the challenges arose and the opportunities arose, and we just kind of went with the flow, really, to see where things would lead us. I guess everything started for us with the reviews of Blemish, which started coming in, and they were extremely positive, and this created a great deal of interest in the album. And so we began to look at distribution and working with different partners around the globe. We didn't compromise on the deals that we made. We were able to make deals that benefited the label enormously. And so we quickly reaped the rewards of having our own label, our own production. And while all of this was going on, I began to receive material from other artists that were looking for labels, looking for me to get involved in projects in one way or another. In fact, the Bud album Gosh, I'd had a copy of that since 2001. And I'd been trying to help Harold find a deal for that album because I thought it was such a beautiful record. And through my management in London and through friends, we've been trying to find the right label for it. But basically, nobody was interested in the work. And so again, by default, it was, once the label was up and running, I said, Harold, if you really can't find anybody else you want to go with, I'm happy to take this on board. And he was delighted and went with us. And so it's not a conscious decision to build this business. I mean, I'm only so interested in the business of the music industry. I mean, I'm interested in the creative side of it. As long as I'm involved in the creative aspect of the label and don't have to get too involved in the monetary concerns of the label, then I continue to do it. And as long as I can create a platform for certain artists that either suit the label or unable to find, outlets elsewhere, then I'm very happy to allow them to come and use the kind of global community that we set up and exploit that in the best way that they can. I am obviously involved in the selection of the material that we release. It basically comes down to my deciding which work I feel a strong connection to, what appeals to me. A unique voice is very important to me. And a general aesthetic, a strong aesthetic work in the material. And then just seeing that through, I very much enjoy being involved in the, creating the design for each, for the packaging of each project, and kind of dress it and put it out there in the world. It's a great pleasure for me to be involved in it on that level. And again, in the interaction with artists, I've always led a relatively isolated existence as a musician, as an artist. But through creating a label, I've found that, there is this global community slowly being pulled together. And I'm thoroughly enjoying being a part of that and enjoying the kind of conversations that we're having. Generally across the internet, generally, sending files around the globe for contributions of one kind or another, and I find this a very gratifying way of working right now, and one that is attainable in the current climate, which isn't always, which doesn't always facilitate the coming together of certain groups of musicians that work in a field that is considered somewhat esoteric. And there's no real financial backing for those kind of projects. But the fact that with new technology we are able to have this kind of global conversation and further it without great expense of our own, I think is enormously gratifying. Enormously gratifying. It gives you complete and utter creative freedom, and this is a real joy.
I'm curious if you can describe the process of channeling inspiration into concrete musical ideas for yourself.
Well, for me, the starting point would be a very an intangible sense, just a tangible sense that something is coming through, that ideas are beginning to form, or there's a wealth of emotion that needs to find a voice. It's very hard to pinpoint. It's a sensation. It's something that isn't analyzed, but take it for granted that it is beginning to surface. You understand that there is something there, and you don't try and get into it too much. I think of it as a gestation period, where you carry this sensation with you for a certain period of time, and you let it grow. You let it clarify itself. You let it find its voice. And the means of doing this can be through listening to music, experimenting with your own sounds, compositions, but not really just getting into trying to write the material, just experimenting with sound and what seems to reflect well on this notion of this material that wants to come through. you can absorb, you can open. I know this is true of a lot of artists. When you get a sense that this material is rising, there is a period where you will go into a kind of sponge mode, where you kind of selectively absorb certain material, whether it's novels, poetry, whether it's through travel. You tend to create a receptive space within your own psyche in which you feel the possibility of this material come into a point of fruition, a point of readiness, if you like. And once you've reached a certain level with this period of gestation, you know that, okay, at any given point now, you can sit down and try and give this work some kind of form, some kind of structure. And that from that period on, there is a greater sense of rapidity in terms of the development of the material. Once you sit down at a keyboard, at a sampler, at a laptop, or with a guitar, whatever it is, the material begins to take shape very, very quickly because you've allowed this gestation period to happen. And that gestation period can last from, weeks, months, 6 months to a year. I mean, I think I had the notion of Blemish kicking around for about a year prior to actually sitting down and writing it. And when I sat down and wrote the material, the whole album from writing to completion of mixes was done within a period of about 6 weeks. So it can happen very, very quickly once you're utterly in tune with what it is that needs to come through. And then as a way of dealing with this rather abstract notion of what it is that is forthcoming, I tend to work a great deal with visual aids, whether it be in my environment or visual art or photographic works. I find that there's a certain themes seem to come through, seem to reflect well off of this notion of what is to come, the Rain True Crow material. On that project, we were improvising material into shape, and one way I kind of tried to keep a handle on the continuity of the material was to bounce it off of certain mental imagery that was coming to me as we were improvising, which had a lot to do with desert imagery of one kind or another. And so this became my what's the word? It became the means by which I created a sense of continuity. If a piece that was arising didn't reflect well on this image that I had in my mind, it was kind of vetoed, and I would move on to something else that did seem to sit well with it. And that way I kept some kind of emotional connection between one piece and another. There was it's certainly not a concept, but it is a kind of the landscape for me was an emotional landscape, and so I didn't have to pinpoint it intellectually. There was no trying to pin it down as such. It remained in its abstract form throughout the process of recording. But it bounced off a particular set of images, which obviously meant something to me at that point in time, emotionally, and therefore the material had that kind of continuity, that emotional continuity, which creates a strength for me in a project when an album has that consistency, if you like.
What tend to be the biggest musical challenges you face during this process?
My limitations as a musician, that would be the greatest frustration. But it is also the source for creative solutions to problems that come about through my limited ability as a musician. That would always be my frustration, really. There are pieces that you think might move into a certain area of composition in which I have only limited knowledge. And so how do I move away from very well-defined frameworks that I'm familiar with? The notion of craftsman is something that tends to alienate me somewhat. I'm not a craftsman, in the way that some certain songwriters are. McCartney would be one of those people you'd say, well, that's an amazing craftsman. I am not one of those songwriters. I don't aim to find formulas that work for me. I don't study song as such and then trying to use, knowledge that received knowledge of those that have gone before me. I always work from a very kind of impulsive, intuitive standpoint, when I'm writing material, when it actually comes to the process of writing. So if I'm trying to write something on a guitar or a keyboard, I only have a limited capacity in that respect as a player. And sometimes I just want to go further afield than that allows me, than my technical ability allows me to. And sometimes that leads to interesting solutions. That means you move away from the traditional instruments. You might you start. I've often, as you can tell with the material, worked with various synthesizers, samplers, and now laptops and process guitars, and tried to move away from the restrictions of form and the technical ability of instrumentation. So when I come to a piece like Blemish, I played down my ability as a guitarist, if you will, and tried to find different ways of approaching the instrument that worked for me, that created a fresh approach to the instrument that inspired me, that made me want to, that immediately generated language, in response to what I was doing musically, a new language that mirrored the new approach to playing the instrument. I think these things are very much hand in hand, Would the new language have evolved had I used more traditional song structures that I'm, obviously very familiar with? I really don't think they would have done. I think it was that I took a new approach to the guitar itself and to the treatment of the guitar in the recording process that opened up new ways of applying myself to that backing as a vocalist, and how I kind of played off of those initial guitar improvisations, which basically were me hitting the guitar as opposed to playing it and striking it in different ways, and then treating it after the fact. So these are just different ways of overcoming the limitations of my ability as a player, and it's not only true of my own limitations. I mean, when I'm working with other musicians, that I would tend to fall into that category of, for want of a better word, non-musician, or a musician that has a facility in a specific area of work, but if you try and take them out of that area, they kind of lose touch with their own bass somewhat. And I enjoy that process of working with musicians that are a little bit out of their depth, because it means that we have to find interesting ways around that dilemma, that problem. And it's nice to marry that with a player that's totally fluent with their instrument. But I find the challenges enormously gratifying, working with technically proficient musicians, as well as those musicians that aren't so technically well equipped.
I'm curious what step you believe Blemish represented for you in terms of your personal evolution as a musician.
Well, there was very little relying on the input of other musicians. There was an assuredness, I guess, in that I knew what I was looking for. I had an idea of where the kind of musical vocabulary I'd be working with. And instead of getting others involved to help me create that, I just went ahead and kept things on a very, very basic level. I guess there was an enormous clarity of purpose in the creation of Blemish. And as such, I felt there was a greater potency in the material, in that, over the years I've tried to strip the material back, try to do away with any element that was, I considered, inessential, just trying to find the heart of a piece of music. And I've always felt that I was something akin to a minimalist at heart, but the work never reflected that. No matter how much I would try and pare the material back to its basic elements. But with Blemish, I seem to strike the right chord from the very first day of recording. I found the language very, very quickly with which to work, and just kind of went from there. And every day was a process of discovery, using the studio, which I just completed building, just using that environment to explore the room, the guitar, and the amp, which was all I was really using, and then the processing in the computer after the fact. So there was a sense of creative liberation. I was very aware that I was moving into new territory as a writer. Also, the emotional content of the pieces was really rather intense, and while I was still living through these emotional experiences, there was nothing resolved about any of the work that anything that I was dealing with emotionally. There was nothing resolved about these issues. I was right in the midst of it. I was living through it. But as I went into the studio and closed that studio door, I felt at liberty, with some sense of security, to delve deeper, to push those negative emotions to their limit and just see what surfaced. And so while there was a great deal of psychic pain, if you want, I don't want to overstate the case, but it was an enormously traumatic period for me. This was married with a sense of absolute creative excitement. At the end of each day, I'd be stunned by what was coming through and really excited by the results. And I guess, having and hearing, what I was dealing with emotionally in the work, there was a sense of real catharsis. By the time I finished that album, after a 6-week period, I'd sort of come through that traumatic period, emotionally, and felt an enormous amount of release, which, I don't think I could have found through any other source. So it was a very beneficial process to work through.
You've used the term new vocabulary several times now referring to Blemish. I'm curious, is it possible for you to define what that new vocabulary or language is?
Well, in a sense, he's dealing with this kind of personal subject matter, and it's been true of much of my work since the mid-'80s, at least. What I was feeling as a listener as much as a writer was that the old forms just weren't working for me anymore. You can return to material that has meant much to you over the years. This is the way I felt. Whether you're talking about, people that work with traditional song structures, whether it's Nick Drakes or whomever, these kind of evergreen artists that you can return to again and again over the years and still, touch the root of the work emotionally, that they still resonate with you. I found that the work wasn't resonating with me as much as it once did. And I began to feel that possibly the form had become tired, had been overused, and that it was possibly time to find new forms in which to express ourselves. And these forms would necessarily be somewhat more challenging by nature. And at the same time, you would regain the potency of the art form itself in the process of creating new forms that spoke to us now. And I still believe that to be true in large part. I have returned to more traditional songwriting since Blemish in some ways, but I tend to believe that on the whole, the old forms that we've been working with for so many years now have grown somewhat tired, and therefore they're too comfortable. They don't necessarily touch us emotionally as deeply as they once could. They're speaking in a language that is overly familiar, and then we have to redefine that language, both in terms of musical composition and also in language. And that's kind of what I was trying to get to grips with on a very personal level with Blemish. I kind of sidestepped the issue to some degree because the compositions themselves are somewhat open-ended, drone-based pieces, or as I said, maybe two-chord pieces, But I sidestepped the issue of structure in that respect to some degree, to explore lyrically, to have greater freedom lyrically to explore the pieces, and lyrically, that is far harder to define. Where to go lyrically with a piece. I mean, it's obviously very, very personal. What finally speaks to you. I found that repetition seemed to help a great deal, as well as a certain sense of immediacy. The lyrics were written on the spot. They were, before they'd really taken form, I was singing them into the microphone, and from that point onwards, it was a process of just piecing the piece, the song or the composition together, editing it together based on the performance, a series of performances of the rough lyric. There wasn't time for reflection. Is this a good line? Is this a line appropriate here? I was really just winging it, just whatever surfaced I would go with, so as to not overanalyze it and not to get too self-conscious about it, and not to pull back either, to allow the full potency of the work to come through if that's what was happening. And it really wasn't until the end of any work day, or possibly the next morning, that I would get a clear comprehension of the potential of the piece, or whether it had worked or not. But I didn't allow myself the luxury to rework anything. Everything had to really stand on its own at the end of that 12-hour session. And that was the discipline, just to kind of go with it, to not recap and not to refine, but to leave everything in its rather raw state.
You mentioned that for your next project, you're going somewhat back to more traditional song structures. I take it that's for the project with your brother that you're working on.
Well, the project with Steve started prior to Blemish, so we wrote a number of songs together in a more traditional vein. So there has been a return to that material, as well as the writing of new material that complements that. The project's evolved somewhat. It now involves Bernd Friedman, Steve, and myself, and the material is written either with Bernd and myself, or between Steve and myself. But it all seems to complement one another. So yes, there's been a return to somewhat traditional forms in that respect. But I think mainly because it's been a continuation of a process that started prior to the recording of Blemish. And also, I sometimes get involved in projects. People come to me and present me with a finished work, so that I can contribute a vocal or a lyric to the piece. And more often than not, these pieces are more, based on traditional song structures. And I still enjoy that challenge overall, and I enjoy responding to the work of others. But having said that, I'm equally the projects I'm most excited about is the material that's beginning to take shape now, that will ultimately become the follow-up to Blemish, which is still working in an area that is far less structured than anything that I've been working on the past year with Steve and Bernd.
I guess we could safely say that Blemish really was a turning point, and that experience will continue to influence you for a long time to come.
I think so. I think what it did was really kind of just explode the form of the song for me, and just there seemed to be a lot of potential in the process of doing that. I guess it just took that first step. I guess I'd felt for a long time that these structures that I've been working with for many years were no longer challenging enough for me, and therefore they weren't provoking new responses from me. And when I had an inkling of what the emotional content of Blemish was, I knew that these old forms weren't going to work. They weren't going to be able to encapsulate the weight of the emotions that I perceived would be coming through with the Blemish material. So I think everything had to change at that point. And to put things in context, I just spent almost 2 years creating, retrospective releases for the Virgin Records label prior to parting ways with them. And spending 2 years on old material was somewhat soul-destroying. I mean, at the end of that process, although I was grateful that I was able to complete a number of pieces that would otherwise never have been completed, at the end of that process, I felt creatively barren. I wasn't sure anything was left in there, and I had no idea what the new material would be like should it ever surface, So the first sessions with Steve was what came after the period with Virgin and the separation with Virgin. The period of writing with Steve was enjoyable, but I wasn't sure that I was going far enough for my liking, far away from where I'd been before. And when I entered into the writing period of Blemish, I just believed it could be anything but what came before. It could be anything, but it couldn't be similar to what went before in terms of my own material. I just outgrown it, and I didn't want to have to go back to it at that point in time. It just had to be a radical split with the past. And it doesn't, as I say, doesn't mean that I can no longer go back and work with form. I can. But my interest lies in pursuing the idea, the notion of song for the 21st century, songs that resonate now in new forms. I've often looked around at writers in different fields, seeing how they cope, with structure or the lack of it, and often felt frustrated that there isn't more available for vocalists to get to grips with, and so it's this desire to create new forms. And in a sense, you're dealing with the same subject matter, but you're speaking to now. At least that's the hope. At least that's the desire. You speak to now in such a way that is possibly somewhat provocative. Not necessarily so, but it tends to be that way with new material. Somewhat provocative, but at the same time, and maybe not exactly easy listening. But the rewards of being confronted with this kind of material are a sense of being alive with the creation of the work. It's like, when you walk into an art gallery and there really is a powerful work of art there that's, the paint's hardly dry or whatever, and you get a sense of now, the nowness of the work, that it's speaking to now, that you can somehow connect with that work on an equal footing, if you like. It's very much alive. It's very much of its time, and I think it's an enormous challenge to think that one can create work that has that embodies its time, that is speaking to its time with a new vocabulary that has had to have been adapted to now. So because we've become numb in the way that we and we've become, I guess, complacent in the way that we approach music, our listening habits, and so on and so forth. There's a wealth of material out there. You don't really need to listen to any new music. You could just explore the past, but does it really speak to you in the same way that something that's created in its time, with the intention of really getting across very, very, very complex emotions? And obviously not emotions that are, as with Blemish, obviously dealing with predominantly negative emotions, but even just dealing with the positive emotions, the whole wealth of emotions. For me, the old forms don't work anymore, and I guess this is just a period in time where that might be true of, a number of the arts, in general. That it's a time for renewal, to try and speak to now, because we're saturated with the past. We're saturated with these familiar forms, and we need to cleanse the system, and we need to reinvent, so that we can be woken up from our complacency and really feel again. I think modern life does tend to numb us in so many ways, and it can be so overwhelming, and we use so many comforts in life to numb us, because the reality can be overwhelming. But I think we have to go the other way. we have to find work that is somewhat provocative, that can really steal up on us when we're relatively unaware, and just blow our minds and hearts wide open, and in that sense we can rediscover ourselves.
Let me ask you how guitar fits into your creative process.
It's always been an integral part of it, in that it is the instrument that I have, I'm most proficient with. So in some sense, it's the instrument I reach out to first, when I'm trying to come to grips with an idea or a composition of some kind. So it has a certain immediacy to it. At least you don't have to boot up a computer or turn on a whole series of outboard gear to get to what you're trying to achieve. You just reach out and just turn an amp on or pick up an acoustic and go for it. And I love that immediacy. And there is still I will sit for hours strumming away at a guitar and the like, and singing and coming up with sequences that I really enjoy. But at this moment in time, I try to find. I don't tend to complete compositions in that vein. I tend to try and move away from a traditional means of playing the instrument. For me, I'm certainly not saying I'm covering new ground as for guitarists in general. But for me, just to move away from traditional, my traditional approach to playing the instrument, whether it's a retuning, radical retuning, or whether it's just the way of approaching it with amp and guitar and feedback and all the rest of it. But I like the immediacy of it, and in a sense, that's what created the possibility of producing Blemish as quickly as I did, is that it just came down to a guitar and an amp, and how to get sounds out of this instrument without necessarily strumming the thing. And so there was this immediacy. This really facilitated the whole improvisational aspect of the compositional process of creating Blemish. I was using an old Ampeg that I picked up. I think I picked it up in Minneapolis when I lived in Minneapolis. I can't remember now. Yeah, it was Minneapolis. I don't know what year it is. It's fairly old. Small tube amp, but it has a reverb and tremolo on it. And I was using Steinberger or the Klein guitar, one of those two for the most part. Minimal effects. There was very little involved on the between amp and guitar. Yeah, I'm not a very technically minded person when it comes to instruments, outboard gear, and what have you. I mean, I'm far more comfortable working with computers now than anything else, because it's I understand them, and I understand how to get out of them what I need. And I'm trying slowly to do away with as much as outboard gear as is necessary,
What would you say are your strengths and weaknesses on the instrument?
Nothing to think of a strength here. Oh dear. I mean, I'm self-taught, so I've always invented my own chords and had wonderful experiences confusing guitarists over the years, showing them shapes that I play and trying to work out what the hell they might be. Oh gosh, I don't know that I have any great strengths. It's really to do with what one is familiar with, It's the same in the keyboard world. There's a wealth of guitars out there, a wealth of pedals. There's thousands of plugins for guitars and what have you, and the same goes for synthesizers. But the trick is really just to learn one or two of them really well and try and get them to speak for you. I don't have a lot of pedals. I have the one amp. I have maybe a handful of guitars at most, and I'll get what I need out of that small pool of resources, because I think you become more inventive that way, and the familiarity is so much an important part of facility. The last thing you want to do while you're, trying to get to grips with writing a piece of music or recording a piece of music is sit down and open a fucking manual. Nothing's going to kill the creative process quicker than that. So, I think familiarity is a large part of it. In terms of limitations, there's just so many. I mean, I'm not really a fantastic soloist. I'd still struggle to find, the right chords on the guitar. If I wrote a piece on a keyboard, for example, trying to accompany myself on guitar, I kind of relearn the instrument every time I pick it up. There are a lot of musicians like that out there. They tend to be composers more than they are musicians, and that tends to be how I think of myself. I'm far more a composer than an instrumentalist. But like I said, in the recording process, you become, nowadays you're the maintenance guy, you're the engineer, the producer, the instrumentalist, the performer. You're all of these. You wear multiple hats these days, and there's enormous freedom in that as well as frustration. But it is ultimately a very, very liberating process to be able to successfully wear so many hats and produce a work that speaks exclusively for you in that respect.
Have you taken any steps in particular to increase your aptitude on range on the instrument?
No, I haven't. There are periods in time when I've spent more time with the guitar. For example, there was a period between the completion of Secrets of the Beehive, which I guess was 87, and the recording of the Raintree Crow album. There was a period there where I did very little writing, just because of a lot of personal stuff I was going through. And I would just pick the guitar up daily and just kind of improvise with it. Just set up loops going with keyboards and sequencers and so on, and then just improvise with the guitar over all of that. And so I had, at that period of time, my level of, my aptitude increased enormously. And when we came to do the Raintree Crow sessions, I was enjoying playing the part of the guitarist of that band to a large degree. But I don't tend to keep up with exercises of any kind. So unless there's good reason, if I'm involved in writing, I'm really not keeping up with any kind of exercise to keep my chops up, such as they are. Can't even use that word in a degree of seriousness. But you know what I mean. Yeah, I'm really, for me, everything's about writing material. It's really not about performing it. And so I'm always looking for new ways of approaching that writing process. And if there's a limitation in my ability with the guitar, the desire isn't to increase that ability, and because I don't think that's really what I'm looking for. As I said, I'm not really a craftsman in that respect. I'm looking for new challenges. I remember when working with Robert for a while, and we were writing material together. Sometimes he and Trey Gunn would come up with chord sequences that were very dynamic, but in terms of the changes, they really didn't present a challenge to a vocalist other than how to get over that degree of volume. The changes weren't presenting the challenges, and so I often would ask them, can we try and take that further, and because there's only so much I can do in response to that kind of chord sequence. And that's really what I'm looking for. I'm working with Frizzell back in the mid-90s or whatever. When I asked him to improvise material on Dobro, it was to present me with a challenge as a vocalist. How would I respond to that? I don't know how to respond, so that's why I want to do it. And ultimately, recently with Derek Bailey, exactly the same thing happening. The conversation across the Atlantic was, Derek, can you go into a studio and just present me with a set of challenges as a vocalist? Just play for an hour, send the material to me, and I'll try and respond to it. And that's what I'm looking for. That's what will keep me interested. What do you do with this? This is exciting. That's what gets the juices flowing for me.
Did you read Derek Bailey's biography?
I haven't, no. I know. Well, I think there was only one thing that somebody told me about it, but Derek's a funny guy. He's got his opinion, he's got his viewpoint. He is who he is, and that's what's unique about it. I know he was really excited by what he heard, and because I actually spent some time with him after that. But you know, I wouldn't imagine that Derek's going to sit down and play Blemish more than once or twice at the most. You know, why would he? For him, music is refreshed every time he sits down to play it. He has a different way of listening, and that's what makes him extraordinary, really.
You've chosen to work with some pretty incredible and highly individual guitarists, including Torn and Ribot on top of the people we spoke about. Is there a certain quality or instinct that you're looking for in these amazing guitarists that you collaborate with?
It depends on the nature of the composition, really. You know, obviously with Derek, as I said, he's presenting me with a challenge. I'm not presenting him with a given composition, you know, to which he's making a contribution. So the setup there was quite different. Similar setup with Frizzell on the dobro pieces that we did together. I guess, you know, what draws me to any given guitarist is a unique approach to the instrument in some way. I mean, it is one of my favorite instruments. You know, the guitar and the trumpet. I think of these two instruments as, in a way, the second voices in my work. And that they constantly recur. Constantly drawn to players of those particular instruments. But it's really, you know, players that have somehow developed a unique approach to the instrument. That's it, really. I mean, I can't elaborate on it more than that, because what happens is that, you know, the composition itself that cries out for the particular player. You know, having written Midnight Sun, it was obvious it needed Ribot. You know, it just screamed out for him. The same is true of other works in the past. You know, Brilliant Trees needed Hassel, you know, and so on and so forth. It's the tracks themselves, and it's just trying to be true to the compositions. And yeah, okay, I'm personally drawn to certain types of players, certain players that take the instrument, you know, that extra mile, you know, develop that vocabulary of their own that's unique to them. And so I do tend to listen to a lot of guitarists and trumpet players and the like, but and so therefore they're in my frame of reference. This is going to certainly help define who I'm going to hear in any given composition that I'm working on. But basically it is the composition that cries out for a particular voice, and there wouldn't be any call to work with any other, you know, a specific musician if the composition itself didn't demand it.
In terms of how you are first introduced to these people, are you always buying music and checking out new music?
I was, less so now, but yes, certainly. Yeah, I check out new music whenever possible. Since Blemish and the formation of the label, I find that there's a kind of sort of small but global community of musicians that are all in contact and communication with one another, in which it's possible to feel one is able to not necessarily be a part of, because yes, of course you're a part of that community, but you can call on them, and vice versa. There's an openness, a degree of openness, which, you know, I often wished had existed, you know, way back, you know, like Brilliant Trees. I often felt it's one of the first artists to really just kind of take that step in and call players that hadn't heard of me or my work and just say, you know, would you be willing to meet me at this time and place and have a crack at this material with me, you know? And I was always stunned by the degree of openness with which these musicians would enter into this compact or contract with me in you know, in relative ignorance, you know, of what it was I was up to. And I thought, well, you know, musicians generally are open. They generally are responsive to these kind of invitations. But I think the invitations just don't come frequently enough. And I think that maybe now with the internet and the sharing of files and what have you, the degree of openness has expanded somewhat. Or at least it is a given now, whereas in the past it couldn't be taken for granted. And I very much like being a part of that circle of people where, you know, we make contributions to one another's work, and there are no fees involved. We just agree to contribute to one another's work. And this is a wonderful sharing and kind of, you know, cross-pollination, if you like. I mean, I think it's potentially very, very gratifying and enormously, you know, creatively exciting.
So at what point in your life did you know that you wanted to be a musician?
Not an easy question to answer because, you know, I fell in love with music, I guess when I was around 12 years old, maybe younger. But I was just way too shy to ever think that I could be somebody that would perform music. So while I might be, you know, tucked away in my bedroom writing songs at the age of 12, I had no notion of ever going beyond that bedroom door and performing this material for anyone. I just didn't see how I could do it. So you might say that, you know, it didn't really dawn on me that I could be a musician in life until I took to the stage for the first time, until I actually have to perform for other people, and then it seemed like a possibility, at least at that point in time. But there was a necessity to write that was urgent, and that's been with me since I was very young, you know, since I was 12, 13, 14. That necessity has been with me, and so maybe that point that I would say that a musician was born in me.
What sort of writing were you doing at age 12? What sort of topics?
What sort of topic? And I guess it was all to do with the personal on some level, but somewhat obliquely, no doubt. Not having the courage to write that directly about my own experiences and not being clued in enough to know exactly what was going on emotionally in my life to that degree. I guess there were somewhat oblique, somewhat coded compositions in that respect.